Democracy, Bridging Facts and Norms.
So I'm Michael Neblo. I'm an associate professor in the political science department at Ohio State University and have a courtesy appointment in the philosophy department as well. I do my work on democratic theory, deliberative democracy broadly understood, and both its empirical and theoretical manifestations. So I really bridge that. That's partly related to my background. My undergraduate degrees were in philosophy and statistics. I say statistics, it had a different name, but so I've for a long time been trying to bridge the normative theoretical and empirical sides of these questions surrounding the proper functioning of democracy.
Why did you feel this urge to bridge them? Because sometimes it can feel like it's two different fields of study and two different specializations. So why did you feel they should be linked?
Well, I mean, there's a number of reasons. One is that I think empirical political science gains vital life, so to speak, from being organized around the categories of normative political theory, and that oftentimes, if the disconnection between them is too extensive, that we get empirical results that don't speak to vital questions in democratic life and normative political theory. On the flip side, political theorists are sometimes apt to do armchair social science and rely on premises in their arguments, their normative arguments, and especially policy prescriptions and suggestions for practice that aren't informed by our best understanding of how the political world works. So I think that both enterprises are just done better when they're done in proximity to each other. And moreover, I just don't see the contradiction that if we look at the founders of modern social science, I'm not just going back to Aristotle. The people who usually defend this sort of combination take a very not a modern scientific, but a more. So I'm thinking of Leo Strauss and some of his followers, and people in a tradition along those lines, where they say, the political theory and social science are compatible, but they are thinking pre-modern social science. But if we look at the founders of modern social science, let's say Adam Smith, right? He wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, a seminal work in moral philosophy, and he wrote The Wealth of Nations, which effectively founded modern economics, and subscribed to a theory called the unity of the moral sciences, and saw not only no contradiction between pursuing both of these, but as I said before, didn't think that they could be pursued very well separately. And so I feel like I'm just going back to a tradition where that wasn't controversial, and nobody really ever explained why it should be particularly controversial.
And then how would you relate them? How would you put them together? Would you say one should start from a very deep theoretical analysis before starting any empirical study, or that it could be another bottom-up or more relational link between empirical analysis and theoretical inquiry?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, in the bigger picture, it's got to be an ongoing dialogue where there's no first and then, but a continuous mutual informing of each other back and forth. I do think, actually, before one starts a major empirical project, one should attend to the normative categories carefully, and there should be work between theorists and empirically oriented scholars. But of course, before making a policy prescription or thinking through what justice requires in a world that's not that's characterized by, say, moderate scarcity. This is a term from John Rawls. That we need to have an understanding of what the best modern social science tells us about the factual premises understanding that. The problem is that there's often not an alignment between the categories that allows them to speak fluently to each other. And so in one sense, what I've been trying to do in my career is act as a translator and help the two sides that often have trouble communicating to be able to speak more fluently to each other in cases where the bridge is too far, the language gap is too large, then to literally function, or almost literally function as a translator. Yeah.
Yeah, so you still have the feeling that today they are not communicating enough. And I'm wondering, as a researcher in your career, how was it to have these two different backgrounds and these two different approaches to similar topic as your colleagues, but how is it received actually to have these two different...
Well, so I would say, there's not enough communication, or it's not where it could be. That said, I actually think things have improved. And in my more specialized domain of empirical deliberative studies, I actually think that the communication is better than anywhere I know of, in that normative theorists have been genuinely open and engaged with empirical social scientists. And the empirical social scientists, many of them have done the hard work of trying to read Habermas, let's say, which is not a trivial undertaking if you're not trained in political theory. And I know a reading group of people, this is behavioral social scientists at the University of Michigan, who did a reading group on this. And so of course it could be better, but in my little corner of the academic world, I actually think the improvement has been quite substantial over the last decade, basically, that there's serious engagement. And my hope is that perhaps that is a model for other domains of political theory or political science being able to communicate with each other. And I have in mind here, for example, democratization studies, or people interested in electoral systems interacting with people who study the formal properties of electoral systems and incentives and aggregation mechanisms, social choice theory, game theory, things along those lines. That's where. So I hope that it diffuses out from deliberative studies, where I think this is at its most vital and best functioning, into other potential relationships between empirical and normative philosophical analysis.
Maybe I would have a more to the ground question, which is when we're doing that kind of double approach, to what extent should we compromise on the ideals when we are trying to assess an empirical case that is in real existing democracies? And on the other side, to what extent should theory be closer to reality, or should limit its potential to become totally abstract and to not relate to what's actually happening anymore?
Yeah. Well, so I think there's two questions here, right? I'm not sure it's the best way to frame it as compromising one's ideals, right? So I have no problem, for example, with Rawls setting up his theory at a very abstract level and not doing near ideal theory. But for his ideal theory, he had to take into account certain things. For example, the sort of future persistence of moderate scarcity. That's an empirical premise, and for example, developmental theories would be relevant to how we assess the difference principle. The principle that benefits are to be organized such that they redound, or inequalities are to be organized such that they redound to the benefit of the least well-off. Well, how do we think of that in intertemporal terms and investments in the poor? And also just the fact of reasonable pluralism. This is an historical fact, and it's an enormously important one. I think he's right. But I don't understand why normative political philosophy shouldn't be informed by the less secure and less grand findings of modern social science. And it's a separate issue as to how we analyze non-ideal theory as we get further down. I suspect at that point we're going to have to include more recent and more concrete studies rather than large stylized facts, like the fact of reasonable pluralism being a function of the history of the wars of religion, right? So, but that's empirical, right? It's an empirical question about the development of Western civilization, and I think Rawls is right on that, and he's right to incorporate it into that. And as we move from ideal or near ideal theory to non-ideal theory, I think we have to incorporate more localized facts.
So not a language of compromise. That's That's important.
It's a language of appropriateness of the kind of knowledge to the problem at hand, right? And Rawls doesn't need to know. He can just say that the people behind the veil of ignorance have access to the findings of all the best modern social science and history and such, without having to specify that, right? So. And I think that there's value in doing that level of work, right? Then if we try to take it down to another level and say, talk about how the difference principle is supposed to be initiated or implemented in the context of a non-ideal world, then we need to know things about dynamic growth in economics, et cetera, it has to get more specific. So it's not compromise exactly so much as appropriate sorting of the kinds of normative arguments and the empirical premises that they rely upon. They need to make sense of themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a pretty strong debate in deliberative theories of democracy, because you have this ideal of deliberation, which was there for a really long time, and now would you also say that the deliberative theorists are trying to make maybe an ideal that would be more appropriate to judge what is happening now in real existing democracies and to try to evaluate that kind of debate that is taking place?
Yeah, well, this I have strong views on and I've written about. Similarly, I think that debate has been set up somewhat the wrong way, and that the distance, the purported distance between some ideal and reality is not to the point. The function of the ideal isn't to approximate it, it's to orient ourselves in logical space. So, for example, I usually use a baseball example, but I'll try to use maybe a basketball example, something a little bit more neutral with respect to not show my American colors so flagrantly. The shooting percentages, right? Well, the best shooting percentage you could have is 100%, right? Well, no basketball player even remotely approximates a shooting percentage of 100%. Now, does it follow from that? And they never will, right? Does it follow from that we should abandon shooting percentage as our normative standard and just say percentage of shots that hit the rim? No, I mean that would be foolish because it would be less validly tracking what we care about, which is the offensive productivity of the player, right? And so similarly, I think that the distance between reality and the ideal is simply beyond the point, and it would be foolish and less intellectually valid to lower our standards, so to speak, and change them. That would be akin to saying hit the rim percentage, So I do have strong views. I'm very much against this. Let's lower the standards or change the standards. No, the standards aren't there because we think that we can get very, very close to them. It's to help us understand what's good or bad or better or good enough.
So then I will propose you a question on the standards for political researchers on democracy especially. What are their responsibilities towards the real existing society when, for example, you're an empirical social scientist and you say that democracy is good, a good one, or a bad functioning one? You become part of the debate about what the quality of democracy, and same thing when you're a political theorist and you set some standards that will fit or not fit a certain society. And as such, what kind of responsibility do you have as a political scientist?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't thought this through entirely, but I think it would run something like this. If you're invoking your authority, or when I say authority, of course it's not literally institutional authority, but if you're invoking the social status that's conferred upon intellectuals as either scientists or theorists, then I think you incur special burdens. But before I go into those, the first thing to note is that I think if we're just functioning as citizens, that we're allowed to function like any other citizen, and to pursue activism or press political points or any other sorts of thing the same way any other citizen would. But if we're specifically acting in our role as political theorists or political scientists and are relying on the social benefit or energy that is associated with those roles, then I think we have new obligations that are upon us. Now, my own view, and this is even true of scientists, is that that doesn't mean that we can't be activists of a certain sort, or that we can't advocate in a certain way. But I think we're constrained in the way that we advocate, and specifically, we don't advocate in the way that a lawyer advocates, which is just try to win. That we can't just pick a side and press it and use all the tools of our scientific and theoretical sort of knowledge or practice. It's really just a matter of practice advantage to bully or otherwise overwhelm fellow citizens who don't have the leisure or the luxury of having the 40, 50 hours a week that they work be thinking about these sorts of things, and that we have to act as in a cooperative mode, a cooperative intellectual mode. So we can have our beliefs rooted in our research and press those, but that we have a special obligation to reconstruct counter-arguments, let's say, for other people in as strong a form as we can. That's what I mean by saying we can't act like lawyers and think that our obligation is just to win, because I think of that as abusing the special status that's associated with that, and crossing the line between a scientist who's deploying specialized scientific knowledge and whose judgment has been tutored by years of research on relevant questions, and just substituting one's will over another, which I think is illegitimate, especially for democracy.
If I may ask a last one.
Yeah.
Because yesterday we had this very interesting discussion about experimental political science,
Yes.
and you brought into light some specific criteria that you think make certain experiments that might have an influence in real politics acceptable or not acceptable.
Yeah.
Could you maybe just remind us which one of these principles?
Yeah,
are?
well, I wish I had I worked this out, and it's very important for me to make this distinction, because, of course, political scientists have come under fire for this recently. I think one of the main principles is the informed consent of everybody involved, and I mean informed consent in a broad sense here, right? Another one is that it's been reviewed ethically by some other entity, that when we're the ones who make the decisions about what's acceptable research, we have, even if we're doing our very best to be honest about it, there's a tendency to be biased in favor of one's own ideas. So subjecting oneself to criticism by others in an institutionally organized way. That the scientists not have some sort of pecuniary or strong interest in the outcomes, and if it's involving elected officials, that it's public officials acting in their public role, and that in expectation there's a potential benefit, and that potential benefit, again, has to be judged not just by the researchers themselves, but also whatever review institution is governing them, and preferably that would be part of the informed consent of the participants, both the elites and non-elites. If all of those conditions are met, I think that it's generally okay to do research that might even influence real political outcomes, because it's in the service of trying to improve democratic performance, not merely treating fellow democratic citizens as rats in a maze.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Brought to you by democracynet.eu.